Hi all, I have another fascinating game to show you today. Leela against Stockfish. Leela playing white. This is in the Chess.com Blitz Bonanza final, 5 minutes with a 2-second increment. So let's have a look at this particular game. E4, E5, knight F3, knight F6, the very solid Petrov defense. We have D4, the modern Steinitz attack variation. Bishop D3, D5, knight takes E5, knight D7. Knight takes, bishop takes. White castles, bishop d6. And you see here that this pawn is actually not protected by anything at the moment, and it's hit with knight c3. Another theoretical move is c4 here to hit that pawn. For example, this position, where white can actually here play queen h5, hitting h7 and d5, but this is known as a kind of gambit position. But it's about equal, this particular position. So there's a lot of theory here. Knight c3 though is played, which does accept doubled pawns. Is this worth it? Now after castling queen h5, black is forced into a compromise here because of this double attack. Black plays f5, a little bit of shutting down of the bishop here, putting pawn on the light square. It's not an ideal move. It does shield the queen away from that d5 pawn. So if, say, g6, yes, then taking, there's not too much compensation for black here. White's getting a big advantage. So f5, bit of a concession. Bishop g5, queen e8. The queen moves to f3, hitting d5 again. A counter attack on the bishop. Bishop d2. Now that pawn, the attack is renewed. It's defended with bishop c6. Now we have h3, rook a e8, bishop f4. So white is starting to put pressure on the dark squares. Queen f6, queen g3. Now g6, this is a bit of a curious one, I thought, because isn't Stockfish kind of pawns don't go backwards? Isn't it weakening the dark squares a bit too much here? Isn't there any other alternatives? I just investigated briefly, say queen e7, without touching the g-pawn. It seems plausible. This kind of thing seems plausible, and it should be about equal, this kind of thing. So anyway, I thought this was an interesting structural decision from Stockfish. We have rook a e1, bishop d7, 4, bishop takes f4, queen takes. Now the queen is eyeing here h6, and in fact white is potentially having the dreaded form pawn to h6 as well. c5, rook e5, which shields the structure and makes use of that e5 point. Rook takes e5, d takes, which gives white a blockaded or an easily blockadable e pawn here. And the pawn structure is shattered, is absolutely shattered over here, it seems. We have rook e1, b6, c4, d4, and now h5. On the upside, there's a form pawn coming in here, king g7. If black had been greedy to take this, then actually simply queen f3 might be best, hitting h5. And for example, this position is just nice for white. So possibly queen f3 is the strongest there. e6 is also tempting. For example, like this is devastating, but black doesn't have to go in for that. Black could play bishop e8, and it should be about even. But yeah, probably the best is queen f3 if this greedy move had been entertained, which it wasn't. So the form pawn now, it's tempting to install the form pawn with check, and it is. King g8, queen g3. Okay, so here we have the pawn on e5 blockaded. f4, bishop c6, queen g5, which is actually a really interesting move. It's got a subtle idea behind it. King f7. I wonder if you can spot what the idea of queen g5 was. If I give you 5 seconds here. Okay. g4. Yes, g4 is now possible, trying to increase the pawn mobility, trying to potentially break black with f5. Now, a defensive tactic is used here, rook g8, stopping g takes in its tracks. If black had played f takes g4, the f5 is pretty dangerous. G takes, this position is very, very nice for white here. Things are crashing through. There's two passed pawns now. It doesn't matter about this structure over here. White's getting a big advantage. So these scenarios are pretty dangerous. If we look at this again, this situation, yeah, this is actually the very strongest it seems to play. E6 might not be too hot. Yeah, if queen takes e7, but here king c7, white's only getting a small edge there. There's different ways of playing it, but all the opportunities are for with white there if taking. So rook g8 trying to defend. So now it's impossible to take here because of g takes. So the king actually just goes to f2, now renewing g takes without the queen being pinned. If we just put that on the board, if g takes, the queen is pinned to the king. So king f2 just renews g takes f5, f takes g4, and Leela's really got what she wanted there. There's extra pawn mobility now, so the potential of f5, and in fact shutting down the opponent's pawn mobility at the same time. I don't know if that's a new kind of tactic where subsequently after you shut down the opponent's mobility after increasing your own, but here black's in a very dangerous situation. And after bishop f3 there's an exceptionally clever idea. So f3 not only protects the g pawn, it also controls d1. However, sometimes the bishop in this scenario might be useful for hanging around to protect the d8 square. If it was on c6, or on b7, it could go to d7. Now you might think, well, how on earth does white get the potential for a bishop to d7? I thought this was really, really nifty. Well, first of all, I thought the g4, the whole g4 and king f2, g3 idea was extremely nifty, but this move is kind of super nifty as well. So white to play here, how can white activate this bishop, which at the moment, okay, it does continually threaten potentially f5 as well under the right circumstance, but how can it be given extra opportunities? If I give you 5 seconds here, white to play, this is a hard one to consider. Okay, I might have given you a clue though with these arrows. So what would you play here with white? Okay, c3, yeah, another pawn sack. After d takes, white just plays bishop c2. Now, this d takes has also compromised, pardon me, the d takes has also compromised the d file. So if the bishop isn't guarding d1 here, then white could play rook d1, rook d6, crashing through. That would be really horrible, hitting the queen and supporting e6 check, unblockading the e pawn. So black's starting to be overloaded because there's also a threat now of bishop a4 to d7, and if takes, there's e6. So a lot of opportunities have suddenly emerged here. And I went a bit crazy analysing the responses from this particular position because I wondered about I thought this might have been the principal threat, bishop a4, but it seems the bishop is very useful while it's on c2 for f5 under numerous circumstances here. If, by the way, let's rule out why bishop c2 and why not f5 immediately. f5 immediately, just taking check. This is fine for black. There's no problems at all. Queen g6 there. Shouldn't be any problems. So, but this is like almost like a little form of Zugzwang. If we look at the possibilities for black here, say rook e8, then f5 is indeed very effective here. So, for example, here taking... This is really crashing through this position, even giving up the rook. The pawns are winning there after f7. The king can't help. Nothing can help f8 queening. You can see that the bishop is not very helpful at all in these circumstances. So we can rule out rook e8. We can rule out queen takes c4 because check, for example, e6. And then rook d1 threatening rook d8, and black would have to give up the queen. That's not very pleasant at all to stop the mate. So if we have a look also, let's see, bishop b7, bishop going back, then rook e3 is good here. For example, bishop's going there, now taking this off, and now rook e3, and now indeed bishop a4 is clear and imminent danger of bishop d7. So this idea is put on the board in this particular variation, with white getting a big advantage. Let's have a look at rook h8. So f5, the bishop remains strong for supporting f5, let alone any bishop a4 idea, and that's crashing through. Let's say bishop c6. Yes, I had fun with this position. Rook d1 then. Bishop's let go of given up d1. We just crash through with rook d6, check, and then e6. For example, this position is absolutely murderous there. That pin being exploited against the queen, winning material. It's nice that the queen is also protected by the pawn on f4. So extreme prophylaxis from white for all the tactical possibilities. So yeah, it does seem as though this is a really, really interesting position. Rook f8, if we haven't covered it, just to recap here, queen g7, bishop takes h7 is a big advantage for white. So this does seem an extremely difficult position, as if all of a sudden black's in a kind of zugzwang. And during the live stream, it's as if Stockfish really did change its mind significantly that it was actually having a massive disadvantage. It started to totally agree with white's seemingly optimistic evaluation. It just seems a very, very strange thing to have occurred, given white had such structural damage on the queen side, and this very, very strange pawn sack, kind of strange pawn sack and blockade over here, and now a sort of pawn sack and liberation over here. Playing on both sides of the board with the potential of rook d1 to rook d6 as well as bishop a4 to bishop d7. So I thought this was an absolutely fascinating game. So b5, which seems to just parry the idea of bishop a4, something to do. But now white's getting this pawn majority, of course, on the queen side, so securing down a lot of endgames, which are now going to be very advantageous. And in fact, so a4, the pawns start being pushed. a5, rook f8. Rook d4, rook b8, and now bishop a4, king g8, rook d1. Yeah, black's really getting stretched out here on a torture rack. And now queen takes g4. This ending here is horrendous. It's black that has ended up with a terrible pawn structure, rather strangely, given the opening, the structure for white after the opening. It's black now that has a terrible ending here, and this form pawn is actually handy in the endgames. The duality of the form pawn is not just useful in the middle game, but also the endgames. So here, look at this. This is just a mop-up. The king can also be more active than the black king here, going on these dark squares. So this g5, f5, that swaps the f-pawn for the c-pawn, exchange of prisoners, as Nimzowitsch would say. That protects the form pawn with check. And now, yeah, there's a potential pass pawn over here and in the center, of course. So here, bishop g6, b6. This is just, yeah, this outside a pawn in particular is just going to be winning material now. The king's coming in over there, e7. Black's really overloaded, putting the pressure for queening there, so winning that bishop. Now the rook's going to be won pretty soon. Yeah, it's kind of all over. Bishop takes g4, and it's in time to catch the h-pawn. The king and rook are in time. Yep. So if the pawn queens here, then we could just play the check and win the queen. Just to put that on the board. Just play the check, win the queen. So it's hopeless. This pawn is dropping, and then not too long to go for the checkmate to be demonstrated with the king and rook. Checkmate. So I thought there were some very nifty operations here, which seemed extremely unusual to me. And what's kind of funny is the outcome of the structure. You'd think white would definitely have the worst endings, but something really dynamic happened there on both sides of the board. So the temporary pawn sack on the king side, then there's kind of pawn sack on the queen side, and all of a sudden black just seemed to be in this zugzwang. So I looked at all the possibility, quite a few of the possibilities there, and it just seemed very, very interesting at move 33 how, yeah, there was very, very little it seemed black could do apart from give white winning endgames with that b5 basically. So fascinating game. If you enjoyed this game video, then please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly, to become a member at chessbowl.net to play other YouTubers. You can also test yourself on variations covered in this game and other game videos from the improved menu, the puzzle books option, which has a link to the annotated game. Comments, questions, donations, see the description. Like, share, subscribe with the notification bell, really appreciated. Thanks very much.